Hello, everybody. This is me, Brian Nakambonde, your host, and welcome to another episode of Umwe Sit Downs. Today, I'm joined by Desiree and Gabeba from South Africa, who have collaborated on a wonderful book that they'll talk to me about today, and some of the interesting, sort of issues, conditions, human interesting, conditions that a Black South African woman faces in South Africa, and how they relate to culture, identity, as they go about living their wonderful lives. Desiree, welcome, and Habiba as well. Just maybe a moment for you to say welcome to the audience and tell me a bit more about where you are and who you are as well.
Thank you very much, Brian. It's wonderful to reach this audience. So my name is Desiree Lewis. I teach at the University of the Western Cape in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies, and I'm very, very pleased to be the co-editor of a book called Surfacing, published by Wits University Press, which is a collection of 22 essays, all by Black South African women feminists. Yeah, so much for me for now.
Right. Thank you so much,
Hello.
Desiree. And Habiba, please welcome and introduce yourself as well. I'd like to hear about where you are and yeah, I guess one of your favorite facts about surfacing.
Mm. Hello. Thank you for the opportunity, Brian. It's the kind of conversation that I really feel hungry for. Again, thank you for inviting us. I also, like Desiree, teach in Department of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, also African Studies, and I'm based at Penn State University in the US. So it's quite early for us here on this side. And Surfacing is a magnificent collection. I can say that as the editor because I'm not one of the writers, but it's a collection of really exquisite writing and important insights and interpretations about the world. And I feel very lucky to have been part of this project. I think it's going to be a very important part of our education and part of our standard reading in the country from now on. And I hope as well it changes parts of the culture.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Really, really appreciated the introductions. And one of the interest, I mean, I haven't read Surfacing myself, looking forward to, in the near future, but certainly enjoyed the piece published in the conversation about your work. And you mentioned that I think one of the key arguments I picked out of that article was that the writings of Black South African women sort of have a limited market, and here we have the two of you being involved in a book that sort of is now a gateway, right, to the writing of Black women and essentially and important thoughts that Black South African women have articulated in essays. But can you please paint more, kind of shed more light onto why it is that the writings of Black South African women have a limited marketing, and how could this market for the writings of Black South African women sort of be expanded to be better commercialized, and also to become something that is accessible to all sorts of readers to learn from the experiences of Black South African women.
Thank you, Brian. I think that's a very important set of questions. And I think it's useful to unpack the question of why does Black South African women's writing have a limited market? So I think it's important to start off with the realization that the market itself in South Africa, within Africa, in relation to the global context, is defined by dominant standards. And these, of course, these dominant standards pretend to be universal. But of course, the standards are very racist, white-centered, and also gendered, very masculinist. I was saying to Gabeba not so long ago that I've recently been reading a collection of essays by a Black South African man, and I enjoy these essays very much. But I was struck by the thought that these are essays that are going to be seen as essays that speak about Black experience generally, even though they are obviously essays that foreground his gendered masculine perspective. And I mean, if we look at work, a collection that's supposed to speak about South Africa, we'll often find that they're authored by white male authors. And the identities of these authors somehow become invisible. And the assumption is that they speak to a sort of universal general experience. So when it comes to Black women's writing, the assumption is that they are not speaking to a broader audience, that they are only speaking, you know, about their specific interests. And the assumption is that they are therefore only appealing to a niche market. So I suppose the important thing is to deconstruct this idea of the universal and universal standards, and to realize that all writing comes from a particular point of view. And what is really very exciting right now is that we are seeing what you call gateways that are opening up into a range of marginalized voices, not only in South Africa, but on the continent. Voices that haven't been publicized before. Even in the kind of blog posts of young women, we are seeing this. So the readership has changed, the readership that is able to buy books, it's placing demands on publishers. And I think conversations like these are helping to shift the focus and make people realize that there are a range of points of view, and certain points of view have been shut out, and they won't be shut out. They are refusing to be shut out.
Right. You know, to your point there, they are refusing to be shut out. I think that's very powerful, and really been interesting to sort of hear how the dynamic of kind of like the market of Black South African, of writing by Black South African women, how that market is right now and the challenges it's facing. But and so how can you know, given that sort of underlying a negative perception that Black South African women only kind of write about their own sort of niche experience that isn't universal relatable. What sort of then? My next question was what makes a good book, but I'd really like to more specifically understand how could they sort of, or how could the writers themselves sort of better position their books to be embraced and perceived in a more universal light, or is it for the writers to do something, or is it for the readers or the audience to sort of are they the ones to change something within, you know, or is it the writers or the Black South African writers to sort of change something about themselves?
I think those are very interesting questions, because you're suggesting, which is actually often the case, that Black women writers are sometimes squeezed into boxes. And recently, one of the contributors to Surfacing spoke very powerfully about this. And she spoke about the way, she's actually a fiction writer. She spoke about the way that whenever a book is marketed, you know, booksellers and reviewers find it very difficult to know which category to box it into. So because of the assumption that Black women's writing is somehow, you know, kind of not speaking to a broad audience and falls outside of the category of universal, the assumption is that all Black women writers write about the same thing, and they all speak with one voice, and there isn't any diversity or provocativeness or playfulness or exploration of questions around the imagination. And all these issues, of course, do surface in the book Surfacing. And for me, that is really what makes a good book. A good book is something that I think encourages one to see things differently, that stirs things up, that doesn't simply repeat platitudes, that doesn't simply repeat dogma. I think for some people, the assumption is that if you talk about Black women's writing, Black radical women's writing, you're going to encounter work that constantly talks about the horrors of patriarchy or gender-based violence. Now, of course, these are concerns for Black women, but they are not the only concerns. And they are concerns that can be raised in very powerful, provocative, and new ways. So for me, the articles, the essays in this book do that. They speak, for example, about the challenges of extreme violence against women at the same time that they explore issues around the imagination and the powers of the imagination, or issues to do with the legacy of women and queer people who have challenged dominant systems. So there are all kinds of threads around South African, the legacies of South African feminist struggles and the legacies of struggles for recognition among marginalized groups that are threaded through what is often seen to be predictable for Black women's writing. Yeah.
Right.
Okay, maybe, yeah, sorry, because there's one little thing that I could mention. I think also the assumption is that Black women are not knowledge producers. You know, they produce interesting stories that entertain others, and they tell wonderful stories about their lives, but yeah, they are not knowledge producers. And this is what the book tries to challenge. I'll stop for that.
And
right.
Can I also say something about your point about, you know, who should make the effort to change the situation? Should it be the authors? Should it be the audiences? Well, I think it's going to take a large systemic change, because Black women have been writing and producing new forms of insights and knowledge, but you know, this has also been neglected by a critical establishment and academic establishment, and even booksellers, and you know, just structures that make knowledge visible to a general audience. So I'll give you an example of Black women's poetry, which since the 1990s has really had a transformative effect on the more general culture, and it has certainly transformed poetry in South Africa. So in that situation, in that particular case, it was the authors themselves who were making changes, publishing their own books, creating their own venues, creating thousands of sold out concerts, even producing poetry on television and on radio in the media, and really having a transformative effect on the consciousness of young people, and also on what counts as poetry. Because of course, what had been written by Black women didn't feature or was not recognized as poetry by the dominant literary establishment. And so it was really this change from below, which even meant an infrastructure for producing poetry was created through monthly workshops that were open to people who were never recognized as poets before, including people with children. So childcare was provided, for instance. So, you know, in that case, it was definitely from the authors, from producing a new infrastructure for creating culture. And yet the neglect from the critical establishment and from the academic literary studies establishment was deafening. You know, it was so striking. So again, the authors intervened in this erasure and neglect by writing about their own work. And recently there was a publication of a really fantastic book that I also recommend that you produce a segment on, called Our Words, Our Worlds, which was edited by Makosazana Kaba, who herself is a poet and editor and an anthologist. And so that is a deliberate intervention in the neglect by the culture, saying to students, to academics, to critics, and to other writers, look at this magnificent resource that has actually changed our culture in the last 20 years, but due to the factors that Desiree mentioned, are almost unseen. So I think your own intervention in making this more visible and more recognizable is part of the change that is going to have to come about in order just to make things more visible, even things that have already happened, even before surfacing.
Right. Thank you so much for that, Gabeba. And you know, I think I'll skip and sort of combine questions here in the interest of time. But for you, Gabeba, I'd like to really hear from you, sort of like in surfacing, right? You know, we have I guess a tremendous array of essays, and I know that the conversation is kind of fixated a lot more around a lot more around, the kind of, the experiences and knowledge that Black South African women write about are sort of maybe perceived as not mainstream, and thus, there's been a challenge of them developing a market that allows them to engage, audiences that could really learn and benefit from learning about the experiences and what they have to share. But can you tell me about can you tell me about an essay featured in Surfacing that I guess for you is personally just outstanding, in the sense that it maybe talks about either the general theme of the conversation so far, or maybe even something sort of unrelated, where we have an essay that just from the point of view of Habiba, touches and talks about something that is profoundly unique and rare, and or perhaps beautiful from your standpoint. So yeah, anything you'd like to share, just a piece to be highlighted and celebrated.
It's of course the most difficult question you've asked, Brian. And I would point to at least two. The essay called My Two Husbands by Grace Musila, which is elegantly written, with the most, immediately from the first words, a beautiful voice is conveying the story. And it is in effect about the experience of a brilliant woman whose educational achievements are magnificent, and the way that these are seen within her family, and the way that they are also seen by men, other students who are men, and who feel a little bit threatened and undermined by the fact that she herself has achieved so much in her education. So it is presenting what might be a familiar story about how women are seen when they enter realms that have previously been dominated by men, and presenting different perspectives on her. And the perspective that she presents from her family that contests this other perspective is the one that is so brilliantly articulated. It's really one of my favorite chapters. The other chapter that for me stands, and it is appropriately the concluding chapter of the collection, is by Patricia McFadden, who speaks about what it is like to live a radical woman's life as an African woman. And she lives in Eswatini, Swaziland, on a mountain on her own little farm. And she speaks about what it is like to grow one's own food, to learn about herbs, to be able to help regulate one's own health. And most impressively, she speaks about relations among neighbors who might together learn from one another across all kinds of boundaries of class, of education, of what is perceived about skin color and belonging, and that how to envision a radical life that includes both our bodies, our minds, what we eat, our relationship to the earth, to plants, to the growing seasons. It's a work that, in my view, is the most transformative. It's a call to action, it's a manifesto, and that is also very beautifully articulated and presents an idea of community and neighborhood, and the mutual constitution of our future that is truly memorable. And I hope that readers will love it as much as I have.
Right, and it's interesting because I think one of the from reading the piece from the conversation, I was really keen to ask, how so yeah, we have the two that you highlighted, but I wanted to really hear from you, recapping how the intersection between feminist thinking and religion, is sort of presented in Surfacing. Could you tell me a bit more about chapters, essays, and that sort of touch on those two, on the intersection of feminist thinking and religion, and what we can learn from that?
Absolutely. There are several chapters that deal with this issue. the way in which religion is also present in feminist thinking in South Africa, even though neither Desiree nor I actually called for writing specifically on this theme. So it's clear that it is a theme that is of importance in an organic way for intellectuals in South Africa. And some examples of this are Queering the Queer by Gertrude Fester Wickham, and Who Are You to Speak to Me Like That by Jackie Jo. Also Redefining Religion in South Africa by Fatima Sidat, who writes about, interestingly, the question of the gender of God. How important is this for feminists who revisit the question of patriarchy and the father and the dominance of men in everything? And yet, do feminists also envision God as a divine she, rather than God as the father, or God always as a he? And it's a fantastic visiting of this question via an experience of a protest march in South Africa by a group of women united across various divisions, who take on the question of violence, of violence against women. And they are marching in protest, they're marching towards Parliament. And among the leaders of this march, even though it was not a religious march, it was a general protest march, nonetheless, some welcoming words were articulated by a religious leader who started her welcoming remarks with God the Father. And there were protests from the crowd who wanted clearly something else that was not going to follow general patriarchal society in repeating this idea of God the Father. So what this taught Fatima Sidat, who writes about this experience, is that if feminists ignore religion, they are going to repeat what dominant culture gives them. And dominant culture sees God in the form of the masculine form. And what she is asking is, what happens when feminists do not neglect religion? Then they can actually revisit the gender of the divine. And what might that offer to people who might recognize themselves in new ways in religion? So really fantastic questions. And in the essay also by Sadia Sheikh, she is also a Muslim feminist and revisits some of the classical texts to show that within the Muslim tradition, which is seen as so dominantly patriarchal, there are actually beautiful records of major thinkers who have looked at the question of the pregnancy, of labor, and of nurturing, which are seen to be female questions, and seen in them characteristics of the divine. In other words, describing God as being infused in similar ways to a pregnant woman, and a God who longs for a relationship with humanity, which is not one of domination and control, but one of love and longing, in the same way that he envisages, this writer envisages the way a mother longs for her children. And the writer is Ibn Arabi, and the author of this chapter is Sadia Sheikh. The two authors who write from a Christian perspective are Gertrude Fester Wickham and also Jackie Jo, both fascinating. In the case of Gertrude Fester Wickham, who is a very well-known anti-apartheid struggle heroine, she talks about what it was like to, in the 1980s, be part of a generation of activists who were formidable in their resistance against racial oppression, but in terms of their feminism and in terms of their sexual orientation, that these were not welcome in the anti-racist struggle to the same extent as the other parts of their politics. And so she speaks as somebody who is also lesbian and Christian and an anti-apartheid struggle activist, about how to make space for all of these identities and what happened when this was not the case, as in the case of the 1980s, where obviously people who had these identities were making important contributions and who were not silent about their identities, but nonetheless that this was not given equal space in the anti-apartheid struggle, with long-term consequences. I think it's very important to see how, thanks to the effect of feminism in the general culture, and especially among students, in the contemporary period, important struggles, such as, for instance, against the exclusionary cost of education, about the coloniality of education, such as the struggles of the 2015 student movements, the roads must fall and fees must fall. It is no longer possible to tell people that their gender and their sexuality should wait. Let's first deal with the important question. As in the anti-apartheid struggle, it was against racial discrimination and capitalistic exploitation, and then leave the feminism and leave the sexuality stuff for later. Nowadays, the feminist protesters don't accept that formula anymore. Right? They don't want to leave it for later. And I think that has to do with the transformative effects of feminism in the broader culture. And then the last thing I would say is Jackie Job's exquisitely written memoir about what it was like to grow up in a Black neighborhood in which family and religion was central, and that how she, as an intellectual and as a dancer, found a new language in which her body was not constrained by some of the inheritance of ecclesiastical tales and how they expected her to be a certain kind of lady. So her finding of her own liberated language of consciousness and of the body is very beautifully written in her chapter, which is, "Who are you to speak to me like that?"
Right. And you know, right. And it just from the examples you picked out there, right? And ignoring everything else that we didn't discuss and that we discussed earlier, there's so much richness and I guess like very novel ideas, you know, that I've come across from the few minutes we spent together here, and I'm sure there's so much more to be met, you know, once somebody picks up surfacing, you know, and I think I'd like to turn back to Desiree for my last question here, which is, you know, how has then surfacing been received by, I guess, you know, critiques, academics, and intellectuals, and I guess, you know, regular day-to-day average readers. How has the book been received? Because what you did here is take all these, you know, thought-provoking ideas and bundle them into one book and say, you know, okay, now read this. You know, when each of the essays and chapters featured could essentially be, you know, a book or a collection of books on their own. So yeah, Desiree, please, how has the book been received? I know that there's been a notable review that you received. So anything you'd like to share about sort of you know, the reception from critiques, academics, and perhaps other parties you'd like to discuss?
I think generally the book has been received in a very positive way. I think people have been shaken up in a productive way, in the sense that they are seeing essays, contributions, the raising of ideas, whether it's about the ecology, the environment, the human relationship to the environment from a Black feminist point of view, or ideas about religion and the meaning of divinity and spiritual freedom from a Black point of view. Ideas, kind of a range of ideas that they just haven't anticipated. And this gets back to what I said before. Black women have been producing work, have been yearning to have work published that somehow it's very difficult to get out there. And I think we were fortunate in having the scope in this publication through Wits University Press to be able to provide a platform to help with the creation of a platform in which critical thinkers, with visionary ideas could say, well, this is the range of ideas that we have, and go against the grain of the stereotype that this must be what Black women want to talk about, or this is what Black women writers are talking about. So on the whole, I think very positive.
Right. And lastly, what are you both most excited about? The book is out. It's now a platform that is allowing some of the best work so far, right? To sort of uh, be seen by as many people and the appropriate people that need to see this. But what are you excited about in terms of what maybe perhaps surfacing will be able to do for writers going forward, or maybe any other efforts that are not necessarily influenced by surfacing, but essentially will contribute to the advancement of more female writers being seen and exposed to the world.
I'm actually very excited by conversations like this. The opportunity after lockdown, after all of these ways in which we have been separated from one another, the opportunity to talk about important themes and to speak about with new audiences, and to do what writing does, which is create new forms of community that have been unsuspected and not yet possible. I'm also interested in the discomfort that the collection brings to the fore. There are some chapters that raise topics that are tender, that even we feminists have not found a way yet to speak about with comfort. And it makes me realize there is a need for further books. There's a need for further forms of communication. And I feel so hungry for that it makes me very excited, even the things that are not very comfortable.
Yeah, I think just to probably echo what's been said, it's the process. It's the process of opening up further conversations. We've said this, I think, in other ways before, but this collection is by no means a definitive collection of, by no means the most significant writers in South Africa, Black women writers. There are so many voices. So I think that for me, there's a hope that this will catalyze further conversations, further publications. The book also contains essays that reach back to past legacies of knowledge making by, for example, the author's mothers, or traditions of radical action that generally are neglected in our fixation with the printed word. So I think that this book is in some ways part of a long tradition of critical knowledge making that's going to be taken forward. And I'm very excited about the different ways in which it can be.
Wow, I mean, it's been more than a pleasure to just hear, some of the get a glimpse of some of the chapters and essays featured in your book, and especially your commentary on it has been, a rich experience. And I hope that, myself, not hope, but I trust that myself, I'm going to definitely, find my way to the entire book, just to expose myself to some of these very interesting and genuinely novel ideas that we touched on today. And I hope that for our for the viewers, tuning in, that you yourself pick up a copy. But it's been a fine pleasure. Desiree, Habiba, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your thoughts, and thank you so much for your great work.
Thank you for the really the great conversation, and for the opportunity to reach your audience. Really a pleasure. Thank you.